What if the Cold War could have been prevented in 1945? One general said the Soviets should be attacked immediately. He was silenced. History proved him right. May 7th, 1945. Germany had surrendered just hours earlier. Across Europe, church bells rang. Soldiers poured into the streets. Flags waved from shattered buildings. For most of the world, the war in Europe was finally over. But inside a commandeered German mansion outside Frankfurt, one American general was not celebrating. General George S. Patton sat across from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, staring at a man he had fought beside for 3 brutal years. The friendship they had built through victory was about to end. Patton did not come to congratulate Eisenhower. He came to issue a warning that would end his career, a warning that would brand him as unstable, a warning that Washington would refuse to hear. "We're going to have to fight them eventually," Patton said. "Let's do it now while our army is intact and we can win." He was not talking about Germany. He was talking about the Soviet Union. Eisenhower stared back in disbelief. For 3 years, Eisenhower had held together an alliance that many believed was impossible. Capitalist America and Communist Russia united by necessity to destroy Hitler. The American public adored Uncle Joe Stalin. Newspapers portrayed the Red Army as heroic liberators who had sacrificed millions to defeat Nazism. And now Patton was suggesting that the United States immediately turn its guns on its ally. George Eisenhower said quietly, "You don't understand politics. The war is over. We're going home." In that moment, Patton realized something that terrified him more than any German counterattack. Eisenhower knew he was right, and he was going to do nothing about it. What followed was one of the most consequential silences in American military history. Patton had identified the next enemy while American forces were at peak strength and Soviet forces were exhausted. He was offering a solution when military conditions were favorable, but he was being ignored not because he was wrong, but because he was politically impossible. Patton's Third Army had driven deeper into Germany than any other Allied force. His tanks had reached into Czechoslovakia. His forward units were within striking distance of Berlin. And everywhere Patton went, he saw the same thing. The Red Army. Soviet troops occupying Eastern Europe with a brutality that shocked even hardened American combat veterans. His intelligence officers reported mass rapes, systematic looting, and summary executions. Civilians suspected of anti-communist sentiment vanished overnight. Entire populations were loaded onto trains bound for Soviet labor camps. This was not liberation. It was conquest. In April 1945, Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice with chilling clarity. He said he had no desire to understand the Russians, only to determine how much lead or iron it would take to kill them. The Soviet Union, he wrote, was something to be feared in the coming reorganization of the world. Patton was seeing what diplomats in Washington refused to see. The Soviet Union was not a temporary ally. It was an expanding totalitarian empire, and it was moving west. Liberated American prisoners of war confirmed his fears. They described treatment by Soviet forces worse than what they had suffered under the Germans. Their possessions stolen, officers beaten, some shot for protesting. Reports flooded in. Soviet units dismantling German factories and shipping entire industrial plants back to Russia. Communist puppet governments installed in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Anti-Nazi resistance fighters who had fought the Germans for years, arrested and executed by their former allies. By May 1945, Patton was no longer venting frustration. He was planning. He developed a detailed military strategy based on intelligence, logistics, and opportunity. The Red Army had lost 27 million people. Its forces were exhausted, overextended, and dependent on captured supplies. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles east. American forces, by contrast, were fully supplied, rested, and enjoyed total air superiority. "We could beat the Russians in 6 weeks," Patton told Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson. This was not madness. It was cold military logic. Patton believed the moment was slipping away. Every day that passed after Germany's surrender made his proposal less likely, less acceptable, and ultimately impossible. The battlefield conditions he had identified, American strength and Soviet exhaustion, were temporary. And Patton understood something few politicians did. Windows of strategic opportunity do not stay open. Eisenhower, however, was looking at a different battlefield entirely. For him, the war had never been only about destroying Germany. It had been about holding together an alliance that should never have worked in the first place. Americans, British, Soviets, three systems, three ideologies, one enemy. That fragile coalition had been Eisenhower's greatest achievement, and Patton was now telling him that the coalition itself was a lie. To accept Patton's argument meant admitting that everything Eisenhower had spent 3 years building was already obsolete, that the victory in Europe was hollow, that the ally America had praised was in fact the next enemy. Eisenhower could not accept that, not because he fails to understand Patton's logic, but because he understood the consequences. The American public was exhausted. Millions of soldiers were demanding demobilization. Congress was already pressing for troop reductions. Families wanted sons home, not sent east to fight another war against yesterday's ally. President Harry Truman had just taken office. He was continuing Franklin Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with Stalin, grounded in the belief that post-war institutions, the United Nations international agreements, diplomacy, could restrain Soviet ambitions. An attack on the Soviet Union would destroy that vision instantly. Eisenhower knew what would happen if Patton's proposal became public. He would be accused of warmongering, of betraying the alliance, of risking another global war. The press would turn on him overnight. And Eisenhower also knew something more personal. He was being celebrated as a hero. Newspapers called him the greatest American commander since Ulysses S. Grant. Political leaders quietly floated his name as a future presidential candidate. His reputation rested on unity, moderation, and victory without unnecessary bloodshed. Why risk all of that? Eisenhower believed in diplomacy not because it was guaranteed to work, but because the alternative was politically impossible. This was the fundamental divide between him and Patton. Eisenhower thought like a statesman. Patton thought like a warrior. Eisenhower believed that nations could negotiate their way out of conflict, that Stalin could be reasoned with, that post-war tensions would cool once the guns fell silent. Patton believed power respected only power. To him, negotiation without leverage was surrender delayed. George sees the world as a battlefield, Eisenhower told his chief of staff. He doesn't understand that we have to live with these people. Patton would have replied that the battlefield never disappears, it only pauses. And Patton was not alone. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill was reaching the same conclusions. Churchill had never trusted Stalin. He remembered the Bolshevik Revolution. He remembered Soviet attempts to spread communism across Europe after World War I. The alliance with Moscow had been in his mind a marriage of desperation. By April 1945, Churchill was growing desperate again. He sent urgent messages to Truman and Eisenhower, warning that Soviet forces were consolidating control across Eastern Europe faster than the West realized. He urged Allied armies to push eastward to take Berlin, Prague, and Vienna before the Red Army arrived. He wanted facts on the ground before politics froze the map. On May 12, 1945, Churchill wrote to Truman words that would echo for decades. An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front. We do not know what is going on behind. It was the first time he used the phrase that would define the Cold War. Churchill went further. He ordered the British chiefs of staff to develop a plan. They called it Operation Unthinkable. The plan was extraordinary. It proposed an Allied offensive to force Soviet troops out of Poland and Eastern Europe. It assumed that rearmed German units, men who feared the Soviets more than they hated the Allies, would fight alongside British and American forces. When the chiefs of staff analyzed the plan, their conclusion was shocking. It was militarily feasible if launched immediately. They estimated that Allied forces with German support could defeat Soviet formations in Eastern Europe within months, but they warned that it would require total commitment and acceptance of enormous political risk. Churchill sent the plan to Truman. Truman rejected it instantly. He was horrified not just by the idea of attacking the Soviet Union, but by the suggestion of rearming German soldiers so soon after defeating Hitler. For Truman, the moral and political costs were unthinkable. When Patton learned that Churchill had proposed essentially the same strategy, he felt vindicated. "At least one man in power understands what we're facing," he told his staff. But vindication did not save him. The press, which had celebrated Patton as a war hero just weeks earlier, began to turn. His comments about the Soviets were leaked selectively. His proposal to rearm German units was framed as sympathy for Nazism. Columnists questioned his mental stability. Drew Pearson wrote that Patton's statements raised serious questions about his judgment. The New York Times editorialized that Patton lacked understanding of diplomatic realities. Time magazine questioned whether his aggressive personality was suitable for peacetime leadership. None of them reported what Patton was actually observing in Eastern Europe. None investigated the atrocities his intelligence officers documented. The narrative was set. Patton was a brilliant battlefield commander who could not adapt to peace, and Washington was preparing to remove him. By the summer of 1945, the decision had already been made. Georges Patton was no longer seen as an asset. He was a liability. Washington did not want another war. The public wanted peace parades and homecomings. Politicians wanted stability, not confrontation. And Patton, relentless, blunt, and unconcerned with optics, refused to stop saying the wrong things at the wrong time. Pressure on Eisenhower mounted quietly. It did not come in the form of direct orders. It came through conversations, editorials, and suggestions that Patton was becoming a problem. His continued warnings about the Soviet Union embarrassed a government committed to cooperation with Stalin. His blunt language alarmed a media ecosystem invested in post-war harmony. The excuse to remove him came from denazification policy. At a press conference, Patton criticized the blanket removal of all former Nazi Party members from administrative positions. He argued clumsily, disastrously, that many had joined the party for pragmatic reasons rather than ideological devotion. He compared party affiliation to a political election. The comparison was explosive. Newspapers portrayed his comments as minimizing Nazi crimes. Headlines suggested he was sympathetic to fascists. Context vanished. Nuance was irrelevant. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. Officially, it was about denazification. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. Patton would not stop warning about the Soviets. Removed from command, Patton did not retreat into silence. He wrote, he documented, he warned. In letters to colleagues and officials throughout October and November 1945, Patton sounded increasingly desperate, not emotional, but urgent. He urged Washington to maintain military strength in Europe, to keep forces visible, disciplined, and ready. Let's keep our boots polished, bayonets sharpened, and present a picture of force and strength to the Red Army, he wrote. This is the only language they understand and respect. If the United States disarmed too quickly, he warned, the victory over Germany would be meaningless. We will have won the war, he wrote, and lost the peace. In early December 1945, Patton met once more with Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson. He repeated his assessment calmly, methodically. The Soviet Union would not withdraw from Eastern Europe. It would entrench. It would expand. Military confrontation was inevitable. In 5 years, or 10 or 20, Patton said, we'll wish we had done it in 1945 when we had the chance. Patterson listened politely and did nothing. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was struck by a truck near Mannheim. The accident was severe. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died. He was 60 years old. The timing fueled rumors and conspiracy theories. Patton had just submitted another assessment warning about the Soviets. The truck driver's explanation raised questions, but no credible evidence of assassination ever emerged. Most likely it was simply a tragic accident, but it silenced the one general who refused to stop speaking. History moved quickly after Patton's death. By 1946, Soviet control over Eastern Europe was undeniable. Promised free elections never occurred. Resistance leaders in Poland were arrested, tried, and executed. In Czechoslovakia, a democratic government fell to a communist coup in 1948. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk died in a fall officially ruled a suicide. The pattern repeated across the region. Occupation, puppet governments, elimination of opposition. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe killed approximately 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into labor camps. The Iron Curtain Churchill warned about became permanent. The Cold War Patton had wanted to prevent lasted 45 years. It cost trillions of dollars. It consumed multiple generations. It killed millions in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam. By 1949, the Soviet Union had atomic weapons. By 1950, the United States was fighting communist expansion in Korea. Everything Patton had predicted came true. In 1947, even supporters of Roosevelt's policy of cooperation were forced to reconsider. George Kennan's long telegram described Soviet behavior in terms that echoed Patton's 1945 warnings almost word for word. The Truman Doctrine committed the United States to containing Soviet expansion, accepting rather than reversing communist control of Eastern Europe. Containment meant compromise. It meant accepting losses Patton had believed were avoidable. Later generations would revisit Patton's legacy. Douglas MacArthur himself, dismissed for challenging Truman during the Korean War, wrote that Patton understood communism had to be confronted militarily. Ronald Reagan cited Patton's warnings decades later, arguing that strength, not accommodation, had ultimately ended the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, conservatives claim Patton had been vindicated. If he had been listened to, they argued Eastern Europe might have been liberated 45 years earlier. Whether Patton's proposed war would have succeeded is unknowable. Whether it would have been catastrophic is debatable. But one fact is undeniable. George S. Patton identified the Soviet threat before most American leaders were willing to admit it existed. He spoke when it was dangerous to speak. He advocated action when action was politically impossible. He paid for it with his career, and possibly with his life. Patton's tragedy was not being wrong. It was being right at the wrong moment. His story endures because it raises questions that never disappear. When should military leaders speak uncomfortable truths? When should political constraints override strategic reality? And when is restraint wisdom, and when is it delay that multiplies future cost? Patton answered those questions as a warrior. History answered them in blood.